Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yoffi Tirosh, and I'm on the Faculty of Law here at Tel Aviv University. Okay, is it better? Great. So our roundtable this afternoon is comprised of distinguished legal scholars and educators of various fields of expertise who have all taken an active role in the past 2 years to voice their concerns and share their knowledge and perspective vis-à-vis Israel's democratic backsliding. We decided to hold a roundtable as our format. It will be composed of 2 rounds of questions, and after we complete the 2 rounds, we'll open the floor for discussion. Let me first present our participants, and then we'll begin. So our first speaker will be Issi Rosen-Zvi. Issi is a professor of law and the director of the Edmund J. Safra Center of Ethics at Tel Aviv University. Between 2018 and 2022, he served as the Vice Dean of the Tel Aviv University Faculty of Law, and he obtains a JSD from Stanford Law School. He clerked for the Honorable Chief Justice Barak of the Israeli Supreme Court and practiced law at Kirkland & Ellis, LLP, in New York. Professor Rosen-Zvi's areas of research include procedural law, public law, local government law, and the law of democracy. Next will be Professor Barak Medina. He is a Landecker Ferenc, Professor Ferenc, Professor. Okay, so it's appropriate. Professor in the law faculty of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He studies constitutional law and human rights law. He's the former dean of the law faculty and a former rector of the Hebrew University. Among his activities, he also serves as the co-chair of the Israeli Law Professors Forum of Democracy. Next is Ariel Bendor, professor at Ilan University Faculty of Law and a senior fellow at the Jewish People's Policy Institute, JPPI. We'll hear about this. He specializes in constitutional and administrative law. He holds an LLB cum laude and an LLD from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He has been a professor or visiting scholar at Yale, Osgood Hall, and Maryland law schools. He served as a member of the Appointments Committee of Ilan University and as a chairman of the Israeli Association of Public Law. Before joining Ilan in 2008, he was on the faculty at the University of Haifa, where he served as the Dean of Law, Dean of Students, and member of the Board of Directors at the University of Haifa. Next is Professor Yishai Blank. He is the Dean of the Tel Aviv University Faculty of Law. He teaches and research, his teaching and research focus on local government law, urban legal theory, administrative law, global cities, sexuality, and legal theory. Yishai is a graduate of Tel Aviv University, LLB, and BA in philosophy, both magna cum laude, and of Harvard Law School, LLM, and JSD. He served as a law clerk also to Justice Aaron Barak, the former president of the Israeli Supreme Court. Dean Blank was a visiting professor at numerous elite law schools, including Harvard, Cornell, Toronto, among others, and his articles have been published in top law journals. Last but not least is Professor Dafna. She's a legal scholar and sociologist, a full professor at the law faculty and at the Women and Gender Studies program here in Tel Aviv University. Her socio-legal research focuses on the intersection of law, families, and gender. Professor Hacker has published numerous articles in leading legal and socio-legal journal and is the author of 3 books. She's also known as an Israeli feminist activist who won prizes for her contribution to the promotion of women's status in her country. Dafna is currently serving as an expert member of the International Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, and as the chair of the Israel Women's Network. She's also one of the founders of the Day After War Forum, the Day After the War Forum, aimed at raising awareness of the need for multi-state political alliance in our region. All right, so my first question to all of you, is regarding what we refer to here as the situation. How do you understand the current crisis in Israel, the reasons and causes for it, especially their legal aspects? A related question concerns timing. We keep witnessing more and more red lines being crossed. For example, ministers and agencies disrespecting the stance of the Attorney General and of the High Court of Justice, the takeover of the police, attempts to narrow freedom of the press and taking over public broadcasting, controlling rating data, and pushing left-leaning, punishing left-leaning newspapers such as the Haaretz, legislation against unpatriotic, quote-unquote, speech of school teachers and academics, and in the context of the war, openly calling for war crimes by leaders and harshly attacking voices who condemn such calls, firing the defense minister, and this is a very partial list. We have many debates among ourselves on whether we have passed the threshold and should up our game to civil disobedience. So, timing. Issi, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Ofra, for inviting me to speak here. So, of course, it's impossible to answer Yoffi's question within 2 hours, and I have a few minutes. So, and of course, there are many reasons for the democratic backsliding that we witness here in Israel. Some causes are global, because we see them, you know, in many countries around the world, right? Poland, Hungary, the United States of America, etc. Others are more specific to Israel. Some are legal, some are extra-legal, and I'm sure we'll discuss some of them here today. I want to discuss or focus on what I see as two very important causes that also kind of is closer to home, in a sense. And one is deficiencies in democratic and civic literacy, and the other is institutional weakness. So, beginning with the first, when the Minister of Justice, Yariv Levin, announced his plan, okay, to implement the legal reform, which is actually a constitutional coup, I, along with many of my friends here, were very much alarmed, okay, about what's coming. The scope of the the scope of the proposed changes and the immense damage they threaten to inflict on our constitutional structure would have left Israel, or maybe it will leave Israel, with an all-powerful government unchecked by any meaningful balances. So, really, I was alarmed. But when I spoke to some colleagues here on campus, really smart people that can split atoms and write very complex, you know, computer codes, they didn't understand what's going on, all right? So they wouldn't, they heard, of course, with us what Yariv Levin was saying, but they didn't understand the danger in it. So I was determined to do something with it. I approached the campus community and offered to give them a lecture on the both the judicial reform, constitutional coup, and the kind of principles of democracy. And after an hour, we organized what became to be the academic protest movement. That is, it's still trying to do some things, although right after October 7th, it's very problematic. So now, if these people, which are, as I said, are very smart and intelligent and literate in many things, didn't understand it, you know, that's clear that many people in Israel did not understand what's going on. And the real problem that years of right-wing government replacing civic education with a nationalist agenda created a huge gap in civic and democratic literacy. So Many people in Israel mistakenly believe that democracy is simply unanimous or synonymous to majority rule. Okay, and say, what do you want? This is the government. They were elected by the people. It was elected by the people, and now let it govern. Why are you thinking that this is undemocratic? So this misconception has allowed the government to portray this reform and the reform that they are carrying out right now. Today, I think they passed in the the ministerial committee the law about that would let them disqualify parties and members of parliament from running to the Knesset, trying to hold to power. So it's really important that we work toward much more democratic literacy, both on campus and at large. The second cause is the weakness of our democratic institutions. So our institutional structure is so fragile that it's a miracle that it has managed to endure for 75 years, and not that it's falling now. And here I want to repent, because we legal academics were so obsessed with democratic and constitutional norms that we almost entirely neglected the institutional aspects to the detriment of our democracy. So here's some examples that you may know by now. So a unicameral legislature, the Knesset, instead of bicameral system like most modern democracies. The Knesset is controlled by the government, resulting in a lack of genuine separation of powers between the legislative and executive branches. There is no distinct legislative process for enacting constitutional norms, and this allowed the government, which dominates the Knesset, to manipulate these norms to serve narrow coalition interests. And there are many loopholes in the regular legislative process that enables the government to pass legislation hastily and without serious deliberation. So, to compensate for these institutional procedural deficiencies, which leave the government virtually unchecked, the Supreme Court assumed extensive powers. These include judicial review of legislation, the authority to intervene in governmental decisions, and the use of the reasonableness doctrine in appointments, for instance, which is something that the Supreme Court of the United States would not even, imagine to do. Look at the appointments of President-elect Trump. None of them would have passed muster in Israel. The Supreme Court would have Okay. So these powers, as I said, are uncommon in many other democracies. The Supreme Court also granted significant powers to the Attorney General and the legal advisor of governmental ministries, powers that are virtually unheard of, as I said, in other democracies. Now, given the weakness of other institutions, the concentration of unusual powers in the Supreme Court and the other legal advisor hands was likely necessary. However, it resulted in a deeply unbalanced and unhealthy constitutional order that requires recalibration. And this is, I'm going to end with this. We must recognize that the Supreme Court and the Attorney General cannot save our democracy, not by themselves. These are inherently reactive institutions, not proactive ones, and they can only block some of the most egregious actions and legislations. And therefore imperative that we find ways to strengthen democratic resilience through broader systematic reforms and active civic engagement. Thanks.
Okay, thanks you. Hi. I think the bottom line of mine is similar to that of Issi, so I'll try to be brief. Of course, I think that the situation is very troubling, and I'll say a few words about, yeah, that's yours, about substance, why is it troubling, and then I'll refer briefly to what I see as the fact that the discussion is focused too much on institutions rather than on substance, and what I see as the failure of our institutions, of our Attorney General, of our Supreme Court in addressing the real issues and try to think about ways out of it. So these are the four themes that I'll go through. So first, what is troubling? I think that the main issue that is troubling, as I said, is about substance. It's about this ideal of Jewish supremacy, as if Jews are entitled to greater rights over, or their interests should be protected over the interests of others, be them minority citizens in Israel or citizens of other countries or nations. And it has to do with intolerance towards others who think differently, discrimination in the marketplace, and interest group politics, in which politics is like a free market in which you can take whatever your political leverage can bring it to you. And on top of that, we have the lack of accountability by the government, by office holders. And it seems that the main manifestation of all these is the collapse of the rule of law. It has to do with the fact that the prime minister serves while indicted, accused of severe crimes that were committed arguably while in office, executing governmental powers. And it goes from there to the lack of discipline within the IDF by soldiers ignoring norms and rules, and many other aspects that relate to the collapse of the rule of law. And as I said, it seems to me, and this is my second point, that the focus of the public discourse has been, and maybe understandably so, on institutions. The government-initiated so-called legal reform was focused on institutions, on the power to remove the Attorney General from office, on substantially curtailing judicial independence, things like that. And accordingly, the protest movement focused on the issues of institutions. And I must say it was a deliberate decision in order to attract a large enough camp to fight these legal reforms, to bring together people with different opinions on substance. And I think that we were quite successful in blocking some of the major institutional reforms that might have brought us even to a worse position. But to my view, this decision has proved to be costly. And when we focus on things that we are encountered now, I think, and I say it with great sorrow, that both the Attorney General and the Supreme Court have failed us in providing protection to human rights, making sure that freedom of speech is protected in Israel, in addressing various issues that relate to the war. For instance, issues that has to do with the idea that the Prime Minister Netanyahu, makes exclusively the decisions about continuation of the war, disregarding all aspects of the power of the government to make this kind of decision, ignoring the right to life of the hostages and what comes with it in terms of judicial constraints on the decision of the government to simply continue the war and give up on the lives of the hostages, and many other aspects, issues of war crimes that arguably committed by soldiers that are not sufficiently investigated, without judicial review of major activities of Israel during the war, and of course issues of treatment to refugees within Israel, issues of freedom of speech, and it has to do with various other aspects. And in all these aspects, the Attorney General and the Supreme Court probably decided to pick their fights and avoid addressing these major issues. And as Issi said, and this is where I conclude, it seems that we cannot put all our trust on these institutions as if they can solve all our problems. And there is no alternative to public discourse trying to explain aspects of substance, of human rights, what human right means, what separation of powers, why is it important, why it is morally wrong not to bring the hostages back by ending this war, and many other aspects that we should continue to fight for. I'll just say that on a more optimistic note, I believe that public opinion can be influenced. Public opinion is shaped primarily by leadership, by statements and activities of leadership. And there is a role to all those who are in a position to affect public opinion, whether they have formal positions or informal ones. And in this respect, I think leaders of the academia and leaders of the business activities and things like that are responsible. They have the potential to influence public opinion, and they must step up to the challenge that we are currently facing. And I believe that there's still hope there, out there, or at least I have to believe.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. I'm not an historian, and I don't have any professional historian perspective. I can even not say responsibly if there is a real danger to Israeli democracy. I personally have some optimistic bias, and I don't feel that in the foreseeable future Israel will not be anymore a democracy and stop to be Israel. For instance, that in the future there will not be any more possibility to hold such a critical meeting like this one. But there's no doubt that Israel is in a democratic crisis. There were people that believed that the war will weaken the crisis, the democratic crisis aroused by the so-called legal reforms, revolutionary legal reforms that the government promoted, and will encourage unity in the spirit of the slogans like "we will win together." But this doesn't happen. The format in the year of war, also the disputes and also of the reforms, maybe is different to some extent, but all the disputes continue, and the revolution is also today. One of the main expressions of the crisis is instability of the regime. And to this instability, there are two main sources: the social source and the legal source. The social source for the instability in the Israeli society is the divides of the Israeli society between different groups, national, religious, political, economic, and so on. And the divides, although the main source is identity, is expressed to a large extent in regime issues and especially in legal issues. And the struggle within the groups, the identity groups in the Israeli society focuses in the fields of law and government. Some groups are characterized by anti-legalist sentiment, and more precisely, a sentiment against what is called the judicial system, mainly the Supreme Court and the Attorney General and their staff. And the sentiment of other groups tends to support in the judicial system. And any group is leaned on sentiments that it perceives as democratic sentiments. However, the overlap between the different groups and this connection is not full. For example, during the last recent months, is prominent controversy on the service of ultra-Orthodox in the army. In addition, the sentiments of any identity group were not created necessarily only in a long evolution, but they are also a product of the political and also media activity of political stakeholders. The legal source of the instability of Israeli society is, as my colleague said, in the ease with which, under the current law in Israel, we can make, and the government make, and the coalition make substantial constitutional reforms, including revolutionary reforms in haste, in the support only of the coalition. And between the two sources, the legal source and the social source of the instability, there is what we can call a sort of dyssynergy. The social splits drive legal sorts and constitutional sorts, which are very frequent, and the illegal is to make such changes, encourage them. And the possibility to do without any problems to make constitutional revolutions contributes to the deepening of the divides, the social divides, and the divides drive the revolutions.
Thank you. Yishai?
Thank you. So thanks again to the organizers. And since many of the things have already been said, then I will try to slightly pose a more cautious or a more skeptic vision of the framing of the question itself. So it's not to say that there is no crisis or that we're not experiencing very threatening conditions, but also not just look at the current way that it came about, but to also kind of perhaps take a step back and think about, first of all, the global aspect of the phenomena, and try to take it seriously, again, without getting into too many of the details, but to take it seriously and to understand perhaps what it means, and then to maybe reframe a little bit some of the things that have been said before. And the first, again, like Issi said, it's a global phenomena, and we see it almost in all liberal democracies in some form or another. And at least for me, this means that we have to really take a pause and to think what it means. In some moments in my reflection, I tend to think that the same way that we saw liberal revolutions or democratic revolutions, and of course each of them took a very different configuration in their national settings, we see the same here. So of course it's important to see exactly how it happened in France and in England and in all the other countries, and it meant a lot. But on the other hand, it was such a wave or a tsunami when modernity, liberalism, democracy, that these revolutions came about, that it was almost ridiculous to think that there would be a nation that would stay resilient to this to this phenomena. Now, of course, there were, right? I mean, the democratic revolution or the liberal revolution didn't take place anywhere, but still in many of the countries it happened. And I think here, again, without trying to downplay often the motives, be they terrible as they might, of those who try to undermine democracy, we have to see, and again, take seriously those that were failed by democracy. And to see it as a very, I would say, clear consequence that those that were unhappy with the results of a system will try to break the system. And in a way, this is what we're witnessing. And again, now it doesn't mean that we need to agree to that, but to think that this is a major cause for these. So again, it is not to downplay the importance of institutions, rights, or the other phenomena, but to, if we try to, again, kind of think about how to fix, then I would say try to take seriously the promise of democracy. And in this sense, democracy has always been a very radical promise. It is a radical egalitarian promise, and I still think that not everyone, but many of the speakers of the moves, you can see that now clearly in the US, of what is going on, to take seriously the promise that everyone is equal, and those that still think of themselves as unequal, as left behind, are trying to reclaim their position. Again, I'm saying something is banal, but I think that it is important to stress that. And to also think about global networks of either we can call them authoritarian or anti-democratic, and these are global phenomena. They talk to each other the same way that the Democrats or the liberals talk to each other, and these are kind of parallel universes. Now, I also want to take seriously the fact that they're not dumping the term democracy. So you could think that it would be, you know, an authoritarian revolution that would say, we actually don't care about this term. We're going full on authoritarian to actually raise some of the values of authoritarianism, which are hierarchy. You know, you could see that. And there is, again, if we think about the global configuration, to take more, you know, the Chinese model that doesn't really care about democracy, but actually, you know, brings values such as hierarchy, harmony, that are more important than the values. And the insistence on democracy, at least for me, is also an optimist. I mean, if we're trying to look for some optimism, it means that if we take, again, seriously some of the claims, not the claims of racists or of Jewish supremacists, etc., it means, at least for me, that some of the battles can be won. Maybe, again, going back to what Issi said, through civic engagement, through various modes of redistribution and not just education, things can look differently. I want to say, and again, and here to put capitalism at least as an element, I think that we can't think about the current crisis without seeing the victims of global capitalism as it is today. Again, not all of them, of course, and what we see is often a coalition of people who are unhappy with the situation, but there is a major segment there, again, in Israel, but elsewhere, that has suffered from the various outcomes of global capitalism, and to see whether some of these can be mitigated. And again, and I think that if we look at, for example, the cabinet of Trump, it is unbelievable that he has put for a minister of labor someone who's a union, seriously unionist, that for Minister of Health, he has taken someone that was a community organizer, even though he has turned into a conspiracy theorist. And these, again, are at least for me, signals that some of the, we can call it national socialism, or fascism, and again, not in pejorative terms, but in their kind of 100 years ago terms, these were the main challenges for for liberal democracies then, and they seem now to be resurfacing. I'm sure I've taken too much time, so I'll just say one last thing, because Yoffi has also asked about red lines, etc. So I think that we can think about two types of red lines. One is the moral, hard, what is done to others that we cannot witness And that might be, again, if we have to put back substance, so it be peace or occupation or what is happening under the guise of the democratic decline. And we can think these are the red lines of what we are doing to others, but there are ethical or personal red lines of what the regime is doing to me. And when I would refuse to actually, take part in that or to actually, say, this is where I stand.
Thank you. So I have to follow up with Yishai's thesis, and I'll start with the global and then concentrate on Israel, back to Israel. So I think really the optimistic interpretation of what's going on globally is that liberalism has failed critical masses in not bringing them the freedom that was the promise, and they are rebellion. Another option, which is much harder to grapple with, is that liberalism failed in understanding human nature. And people don't really want freedom as liberalism thought they would. It's too scary, it's too confusing. They want someone to tell them what is right and what is wrong. They don't want to figure that out themselves. A third explanation is that there are very cynical leaders who are using new ways to mobilize the masses, mainly social media, fake news, very quick and cheap messages. And they are recruiting these fears and confusions, but by actually lying to the public and saying things that are completely wrong and biased and unfounded and won't be realized, to destroy democracy from within. And I think all three explanations are there and tell part of the story. And so when we're thinking of how to move on, we have to tackle each one of them. And going back to Israel, we have to understand the weight of each one of these explanations in the local context. So I will use the gender lens and the question of women's equality in Israel as a case study to further understand what's going on. So I think as feminists, we never thought that Israel is a complete democracy and that we have gained equality, because we don't have equality in our basic laws. It's not only that we don't have a constitution, we don't have the right to equality in our basic laws. And in the specific law that promises women legal equality, from the beginning, there was Article 5 saying that, oh yeah, equality is nice for women, but not on family matters. So as a family law scholar, I'm embedded in a field that never even promised equality for women. But I think that in general, we were also caught in the paradigm of progress. We thought that it will always get better. And then in the beginning of the end of the 90s, the beginning of the third millennium, we thought, oh, there is a backlash. There is a global backlash. That was the word. Well, when you say a backlash, it sounds like it's a minor challenge. We'll overcome the backlash. Now we're talking about illiberalism, this new system of organized governmentality with its values and its mechanism, and that's a new story. That's a paradigm shift. In Israel, men always done deals on the account of women's rights to equality, and I mentioned Article 5, but we have religious family courts, we have rabbis all over, and I think one of the problems is this alliance, not only with Judaism as a religion, but with the most patriarchal stream of Judaism. So it's not the Reform, the conservative, not even the religious, it's the ultra-Orthodox Jewish religion. And this alliance is part of the historic scene. And Issi mentioned judicial activism, which was very prominent when it comes to women's equality, again, trying to overcome the legal deficit and compensating women for what the parliament and the government are not doing. So it opened more roles in the IDF, and it enforced the government to nominate women for leadership roles. And it decided that the property in the family should be divided equally, and more Supreme Court decisions that changed the landscape legally. But going back again, I think Issi mentioned the education system. It was never followed by mainstreaming the right of women to equality within the education system. And it's not only that it wasn't there, it was that the state is funding education systems that are anti-humanistic, anti-feminist, anti-democratic. And that's part of what the state does for 75 years. So many children, and again, this is the demographic thing, an ultra-Orthodox woman has 7 children on average. A secular Jewish woman has 2 children on average. It's part of the game. So in the ultra-Orthodox education system, children are indoctrinated against women's equality. So it's part of what we've been allowing. At the same time, the liberal camp has not developed its own, we're talking about the book cupboard, what it is that our children are being taught. And in the secular schools, they are being teaching, not only not teaching anything about feminism, but teaching the Bible again and again and again with all these hidden or not so hidden patriarchal messages. We mentioned several institutions that have failed us. I think another institution is the media. It's unbelievable how the media is not telling us the truth, not what's happening here, not what's happening in the occupied territories. So another guardian of democracy that we all thought would be there for us has failed us. And another structure that is failing us is the opposition. There is no real opposition in Israel, and there are Knesset members that are being paid to voice an alternative, and they are failing us as well. And on top of us, there is a war, which is always a gendered and gendering phenomena. So now to have some space to talk about the impact on women's equality is really almost impossible. But I am proud of a women's leadership in this time. Yoffi mentioned the Day After the War Forum, which was founded by women, Women Wage Peace, which for many years now is, I think, one of the very few organizations that insist on the word peace as part of the public discourse. Mommy's Awake, which is a new organization of mothers of soldiers, and building an alternative. So these are just examples of women's organizations that are filling the vacancy of the opposition of the educational system. And whether it's because we are expert or because we are mothers, we are insisting on a different vision of Israel. And a final sentence on civil disobedience. For many months now, I'm arguing that if all of us won't go onto an indefinite strike and just refuse to do anything, I think we are in danger that there won't be another election. So I do hope that the big unions, that the leaders of the labor market, followed by, of course, universities, etc. Universities cannot do that on themselves, just will refuse to function. We are functioning day after day, and it's becoming harder and harder. And every day that we are functioning, we are normalizing what is going on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, yeah, we need to take a breath. I've been thinking and writing about emotions lately, and my ear caught repent and pride, and 4 of you used optimism, 1 used hope, and that leads me, it's a great segue to our next topic of conversation, which is our role, both as legal academics and as citizens. What tools do we have? What tools do we still have in our toolkit to curb the rapid deterioration of Israel's democracy? What dilemmas do we have as academics trained to study the legal terrain and analyze it rather than to shape it and influence it? Given that all of us here and many others work in public universities and have diverse classrooms, how can we speak up against the current regime, and what qualms do we have? I want to also add, it repeated here the failure of the government civic education for schools. I think there is a question about academia in general and about legal academia and its role before January 2023, of how the extent to which it is engaged in society, the extent to which it speaks to the public, both through, many means, lectures, publications in Hebrew that are not so highly regarded for our promotions, etc., and appreciation of civic participation of academics. So these are my questions to you. We'll go in the same order, and please try to be short so we'll have time for discussion. Issi.
Thank you very much. Just a short comment on Dafna and Yishai. I think they will not eliminate the elections, and this is because the insistence of democracy that Yishai mentioned, but I'm not so optimistic that this insistence of democracy is what we are thinking of as democracy. So they will rig the election, but not eliminate it and get to the same result, which is even more dangerous because, the camouflage of a democratic regime. So what is to be done, as Lenin asked? So I want to use Albert Hirschman's famous classification of the two options that we have. One is voice and the other is exit, right? So if we're talking about voice, it's a representative democracy, so our voice should be the opposition. But as Dafna mentioned, a few minutes ago, the opposition is nowhere to be found. So we're supposed to have people who are representing us in the Knesset, and they fight with each other and do nothing in order to try to challenge this government. And it also has to do with what I said before, the institutional weakness, because in Israel the opposition is really weak, okay? So they can do some things that can raise, she'iltot, questions to the government, and things like that, but they have, in the legislative process, they're powerless, okay? They are like you see MK Rotman, just railroading, legislation in his committee, etc., etc. So unfortunately, our representatives, we cannot, trust them to do the work because both they are very bad at it, all right, politically speaking, and second, they're very weak in terms of the legal powers that they actually have. So the other way to, to voice our protest is going, taking to the streets and using all sorts of civil actions and protests. And here, as I said, as one of the people who organized, the protest before, it was a miracle. It was a really a mystery to me. How did it happen? And now you see all these, people who were part of the protest trying to replicate it, and how do we do it again? And they fail each time. So maybe something will happen. And I think, for one, that I'm going, to the protest every week. Although I'm desperate, but I think it's really, it is mysterious, all right? So maybe something will happen and then a button will be pushed and people will take to the streets. I don't know. It's important that, you know, people are out there, even if it's rather small right now. And third way to voice, you know, it's escalating civil action with civil disobedience, all right? And civil disobedience is something that people talk about. The question is what exactly can we do that won't, you know, backlash, all right? You know, we cannot not pay taxes because we're all employees of the university, so unless the university decides not to pay our taxes, it's really a question, what is part of disobedience? I would be very happy to hear what, you know, the rest of the panel thinks, because I for one think disobedience is legitimate in at this time, but I don't know exactly what does it mean. And again, when you do something, disobedience, civil disobedience is really dangerous because you know, you do something wrong, it can backlash, it's, you know, it can ignite, you know, civil war, we are on the verge of such, you know, a civil war. So I'm afraid that and education, whatever we can do, I kind of not exactly agreeing with Yoffi's premise that we're not supposed to be educators. I think we do, definitely at this time.
Did I say that we're not supposed to?
Yeah, you say that we have to be. So Yishai and I have some kind of disagreement about what we should do as educators, but
I will say that.
all right.
Don't worry.
Okay, so that's voice, and these are our options, and you know, each one is more problematic than the other, and this is why we're in such a loss. Moving to exit now, we can leave the country, of course. This is something that some of us can do that. We are the mobile, as Gadi Taub said, the mobile class.
Even that is becoming harder and harder.
Canada still accepts, I think.
But even that you cannot take for granted.
No, of course, it's very difficult for many of us to do both because some of us can't, okay, for all sorts of reasons, and the other is some of us don't want to. We love this country. I for one love Israel, and I love Tel Aviv, and I don't want to open a bodega on the 2nd Avenue. So, and who take me at 56? So that's a problem. So the last option that I would give is kind of, so there is an option of federalism, which is fantastic in a way, fantastic not in terms of it's good, but fantasy. The idea of it doesn't look that it will happen for all sorts of reasons, but we could have provinces, the liberal province and the ultra-Orthodox province, etc., etc. And some people are talking about it very seriously. Okay, so I was in a conference where they discussed, what's his name? Kalkelan. I forgot. He was very high up there when, even when Bibi was. Anyway, so federalism is one option, but what I want to offer, Eugene, exactly, לא Kanterovich, אבל
Eugene
Kendall. I don't know if you heard about Eugene Kendall's plan for, alumot, he calls it. Wrap up. So the last thing I would say is that we have an option that is in between voice and exit, and it has to do with local governments. Okay, so we think all the time of separation of powers as the horizontal separation of power we discussed before between the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary, but we have another type of separation of powers between central government and local governments. And local government have several, significant powers that they can use and sometimes do. Think of what Tel Aviv is doing, right? About transportation on Shabbat, about businesses open on Shabbat, about voicing its disagreement with the central government. So what we also can do is retreat to the local government, regroup, and wait for the right time to take over the central government.
Thanks. And that's not fantastic, right? That's the reality. Well, I'll refer briefly to Yoffi's question. I'll do that very briefly because I'm not sure that it's of interest to all those who are here about the role of legal academics, and then I'll say a word about what should we do. So I think that as legal academics, we have three main roles in trying to save the identity or to protect the identity of our country. One, which is sometimes behind the scene, but it's quite important. I think it has to do with developing legal concepts, developing the law in order to assist the Attorney General, to the Supreme Court and others to be effective in striking down attempts at bringing down our democracy and things like that. So again, it's not of interest maybe of the general public, but I think it's very important role. Additional one, which is of course public, has to do with the translating moral arguments into legal ones, raising awareness to injustices, as Dafna very eloquently did just now. But I think that sometimes what the jurist has to say is it's quite agreeable. It's not that complicated. We just sometimes tend to ignore all kinds of moral truths that should be presented and bring awareness and things like that. So it's an important role that we all should take part in. And the third aspect, and this relates to what Issi has talked about, has to do with the role of legal scholars in addressing means. What type of means should be taken, can be taken, and their effectiveness, their permissibility, long-term effect. And I think that in this respect, and I put aside the issue of legal academics in this respect, I think we should be very much aware of the concern of what is called chilling effect. It is the idea that sometimes people do not even challenge the system. They are so deterred from criticizing the government that they completely avoid it, and therefore the government or the police or others do not have even to execute their powers. And we see it already with judges in lower courts that are concerned about their promotion, their status, and it affects their ruling. We see it with some leadership within academia that are concerned that if I raise my voice, my institution will be adversely affected or something like that. And many other, of course, it has to do with people in the press and other places. And the concern is that I think that our role, and this relates to Issi's question, what can be done, what about civil disobedience and things like that, I think the number one principle is that each of us should think to herself, to himself, what price have I paid? Not I'm willing to pay, what price have I paid already in order to save my country? And this is the question that we have to ask ourselves. Soldiers pay huge price, and we are soldiers in this civil campaign in our addressing the internal threat that we are facing. And so we pay some price by going to these demonstrations that, of course, it's not sufficient price. And paying a price is the willingness to take risks that we will be harmed, that our career will be affected, that we will not be appointed to certain positions that we are looking for, that even we might be arrested, and other aspects. But I think that if we are not willing to pay a price, we will not be able to prevail in this campaign. And again, I'm not in a position to preach to others, well, you should do this, you should do that. I think we'll just have to it's a personal decision. I remember I once was invited, it was before the war, to a meeting with hundreds of reserve soldiers that each of them serves on a volunteer basis. And they wanted to hear about the threats to our country. And it was very important then, not because of formal reasons, to leave the decision whether to stop volunteering to serving or something like that to individual decision. It's a personal decision because we cannot ask anyone to pay a price. But I think it's important for ourselves to think, what price am I willing to pay and what price have I paid? And personally, I would say that I think, regrettably, that I did not pay enough in order to protect our country, and it shows that we are losing. And this is a lesson for each and every one of us. It's still not too late, but very soon it might be too late.
I'm going to take my privilege for a second as a moderator before I pass on the microphone, and perhaps add, for those of you who are not from Israel, that many of us here are members of the Law Professors Forum for Democracy, which was established 2 years ago, and have been spending a lot of time writing position papers for the general public, for journalists, to understand the legal terms, and unlike what Barak was saying, to translate moral, ethical issues into legal terms, doing the opposite, so translating legal terms to plain language, giving speeches in rallies throughout the countries, holding hundreds of salons where going to people's homes and speaking and explaining what's going on. And apropos prices, some of us who are activists even before the judicial overhaul, Dafna here is an example, being exposed to very harsh personal threats by men's organizations that really physically endangered her and legally harassed her. And nowadays, many of our colleagues who speak up about international humanitarian law are being accused of unpatriotism and even risking Israel's ability to protect itself. So these are things we should take into account, and I think it was important for me to add them to the discussion. So Ariel, please.
Thank you, Yoffi. I have to admit, legal activism in the field of law, of legal scholars from the academia, puts me personally into a dilemma. There are a few reasons for this. For instance, the students I teach, they have different opinions. Actually, a lot of students come to the university, to the law school, with their own legal opinions, not only political, but legal opinions. And it's important for me that everyone will believe that they get from me the best legal education without any bias that part of the students will understand as a political, even partisan bias. In addition, in different issues, there's the gap between what I, as an individual, Ariel, would like to be between the professional conclusions, not only regarding the interpretation of the existing law, but also regarding the desired law. But although I have a dilemma, I agreed at the time to request to participate in a team that tried in order to promote compromises. And today, as Yoffi mentioned in the beginning, I participate in a research team of the JPPI, which try to formulate proposals for a constitution that will focus on governmental issues. The head of the project, Professor Adida Stern, call it, I don't like it, but he calls it a thin constitution, including, and this is the most important, basic law regarding legislation process and judicial review. This activity, although it is based on my professional knowledge in constitutional law, there is some dimension of activism. I'm not sure it will succeed. It involves willingness for compromise in controversial issues, including, I have to admit, deviance from my insights as a researcher, and also taking account of the feasibility of the political feasibility. And personally, there's almost no rule or basic law that this team is formulating that I think that is ideal. This is a price that all the participants in this team have to pay, but it is the only way for an attempt to get out of the severe crisis. The splits in the Israeli societies are true. They are part of the Israeli reality. And the sentiments of the different groups clash with each other. And even if there were feasibility, political feasibility, which is not based on a broad consensus for an establishment of a constitution, that I would think this is an ideal constitution. Such a constitution wasn't appropriate. The organizing idea of the JPPI team is because of the political and the social splits. There's not feasibility for an establishment in a broad consensus of a whole constitution, which will compass the range of topics that are customary regulated in a constitution, including human rights and identity issues. And the project is intended to enable to establish a constitution and the first and most important stage, a basic law on the legislation process and judicial review. And such a constitution, even if it will include, for the time being, only governmental issues, will allow for a stable anchoring of basic constitutional rules of the game, and will grant real constitutional status, not only quasi-constitutional status, to the basic governmental branches, the elections, the authorities, relations between them, and so on. I have no time, so maybe later.
Thank you. So going on with the theme of remorse or repent. So for me, one of the things that came to my mind is Marx's comment, or the last thesis on Feuerbach, that the philosophers have tried to understand the world and it's our role to change it. And I think that there is a long legacy in which academics have heeded to this call. And in a sense, I think that sometimes understanding and changing actually stands in contrast. And I think that at this moment, at least again, one of the things that I'm trying to think about is whether the attempt to listen to the moral calling of changing the world, of making it a better place, actually also prevented us from understanding the world. And I do think that it comes again, especially in Israel, with the fact that we have not studied enough Israel. Yoffi mentioned some of us, and myself actually not included. A lot of my writing was in Israel, but I do think that again, as a phenomena, we do have to take this into account. So Yoffi mentioned some of the things that, legal academia or the promotion process doesn't take into account. It also really induces us to study the US and England and elsewhere in order to publish in English and outside of Israel. And that meant that not enough of us have really studied Israel, the processes that are taking place here, and also sometimes with a real and genuine and authentic wish to moralize, to politicize, and to change. We didn't see enough of the things that happened. So I think that one of the things that we need to go back is to understanding. So understanding the processes that are taking place, really, and again, understanding doesn't mean justifying, but to really understand the way Zimmel, for example, orders us, right? First thing that sociologist has to do is to understand the society where they are. And I think that here, again, kind of broadly speaking, we have failed to see this process. And I don't think that it's only Israel. Again, globally, no one saw this coming. Almost no one saw. There were whole segments of society, spatial, but also classes that we didn't look at. And this came with a vengeance. And so I think that, again, without giving up on scholasticism and the commitment, again, that many of us are still engaging in, we do have to go back to basics in at least this sense of really trying to cover all parts of society, to cover our society, and to really understand that. And again, and I think that here, and I'm not presenting a position on that, I think that there is a real dilemma of whether we have been there for too neutral or too kind of quiet, or actually too partisan and too committed to a position. And I myself, actually, I don't know. So I think that it's, for me, a dilemma, one of the dilemmas that Dafna put on the table, and I think it was really beautiful to see these dilemmas, right? I don't think that you presented a clear case of where we are or how to understand the situation. So I would say, but also going back to Yoffi's question, should we stop teaching, or should we stop normalizing, or should we stop doing that? I would say no, teach, research, and until we can't do that anymore. So I think that this is our main commitment. I'm not saying that there would be a point where a red line, but for me it would be, this is what I do. I teach and research, but in a broad sense.
I just want to clarify that I didn't suggest stopping to research and teach, but what do we do extra, or what do we do differently in our teaching and research?
You raised the question.
Okay.
So I'll try to share with you the way that I'm trying to save my sanity by being both a citizen, an activist, and a scholar. So in my research, I've always tried to create a distance between activism and my scholarship, in a sense that I'm searching for research questions that I don't have an answer to. When I get an answer, it might be translated to activism, but I never chose my research question based on my activism. Because when I'm doing activism, I know the truth. And when I'm doing research, I want to justify my time and the funds that the state is putting into me in searching for new knowledge. So that is a clear cut for me. Teaching, in a sense, is more complex. I'm privileged to teach critical thinking. So in a sense, I can do my thing without, contemplating about it too much. But there was a point when my activism interfered in my teaching. And because I'm a family law scholar, and because, as Yoffi mentioned, activism became so personal, I realized that I'm less effective in class when I'm teaching family law than other professors. And I had to make a choice. And I thought that there are excellent professors who can teach family law, and that my role as activist in the field is more important. So I'm not teaching family law for quite a while now, which was a price for me. But I realized that but I realized that when I entered the class, the first class, students already read about me, Googled me, and had an opinion of me. So they weren't listening as they would listen to another professor who would say the same thing, but wouldn't be judged in the same way. Now I think we are facing new dilemmas in the classroom. I have soldiers in my classroom that are on active duty now as reserved. Do I criticize the IDF, even for banal thing, on gender equality and the IDF? Students who are traumatized, and I don't even know based on what. So how do I speak? How do I listen? And Yoffi talked about emotions and feelings, and I have an article that I'm very proud of titled "Crying on Campus," and from a few years back, realizing that this is a community of people, of humans, and if we don't understand feelings and emotions in our interactions, we are not as good teachers as we might think. In my activism, and going back to Barak's point, that we have to sacrifice now. I took upon myself to be the chair of the Israel Women's Network. Trust me, I don't have the time. 3 months a year I have to be in Geneva, in the UN, in addition to all my duties on campus. It just doesn't make sense. But I do it because for me, these are times of urgency and dire state. And it's like I have to give all that it is that I can before it's too late. And Issi mentioned the local government sphere. What I'm facing now, the Israel Women's Network is a lobby organization. How do you do lobby when you can't do lobby? So I'm trying to push to rethinking lobby, and not only on the mezzo level of municipal governmentality, but seeing every woman and potentially men. I'm going to establish a men's group as allies, because we learned that women can be horrid anti-feminist politicians. So this is not the answer. So the division between women and men has to collapse, and we have to work together towards a feminist reality. So how do I create a language that is accessible, that is tailored to women wherever they are? How do I bring them on board as agents of change, each and every one? So this is the mission as an activist. Thank you.